It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the keynote this evening with Irit Rogoff. The keynote, as you know, is part of a two-day program with presentations, keynotes, workshops, and screenings, seeking to reflect on cultures and architectures of education today, and speculate about what futures may lie on the horizons of knowledge production. So with as I explained in the afternoon, but I will repeat again, we started this endeavor with colleagues and long-standing collaborators at University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University. We came up with this idea that during the Bauhaus exhibition here at Nottingham Contemporary, we wanted to organize a series of talks and conversations and workshops reflecting on the potentialities but also the challenges of education today. Architectures of Education is also a collaboration with our colleagues from Efflux Architecture, Nicholas Hirsch and Nick Axel. And Nick Axel is here with us today, was moderating a panel this afternoon. And also, I would like to extend our thanks to Kingston University for their generous support and encouragement throughout this journey, specifically to Mary Vaughan Johnson, the head of Department of Architecture and Landscape at University at Kingston University, and also Bill Velasquez. Both of them are today here with us as well. Bill is the Director of Research at the School of Art and Architecture at Kingston. So this conference brings together some of the brightest thinkers and practitioners investigating cultures of education. This afternoon, we had the chance to listen from colleagues touching upon issues around radical pedagogies, also 1967 Rice Design Fest, and also the work of David and Mary Mads. Tonight, we have Irit Rogoff. Irit is a writer, educator, and curator, and organizer. She's a professor of visual cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London, a department that she founded in 2002. Irit works at the meeting ground between contemporary practices, politics, and philosophy. Her current work is on new practices of knowledge production and their impact on modes of research under the title of Becoming Research. Becoming Research is also the theme for today's lecture. Irit advocates that research has moved away from stable bodies of knowledge to be excavated, as well as away from recognized subjects whose validity is universally recognized. For Irit Rogoff, research models emanating from practice have ceased to be the context or the preparation for work and have become, instead, the main event of activity. These have had significant impact on so many areas of arenas of knowledge production across the humanities and the social sciences, and have countered the bordering and continents of knowledge towards platforms of shared subjectivity. Tonight, Irit will explain what she means by the research turn within art and curating, and of how research has moved from being a contextual activity that grounds production and exhibition of art to a mode of inhabiting the world in its own right. Irit Rogoff is also part of the collective Free Thought. They were the artistic directors of the Norwegian Triennial, the Bergen Assembly, in September 2016, and also the editors of the Infrastructural Condition published in the wake of this event. Rogoff is also co-founder in 2017 of the European Forum for Advanced Practices, a Europe-wide forum for engaging with and developing a set of principles for advanced practice-driven form of research. In 2019, Rogoff received an honorary doctorate from Aalto University in recognition of her work in developing and instituting the field of visual culture. So now just a few housekeeping notes. Fire exits are, there, we have two here in the space. One is in the back and the other one is through the main entrance. And in the case of fire, please follow indications of my colleagues. Also, toilets are outside of the space on the right. We are video recording these keynotes, so if you don't want, it is going to be available on our website and also on the journal. So if you don't want your questions to be recorded, please talk to a member of staff. Finally, I wanted to say that the public programs and research is generously funded by the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University. And really these support allow us to realize events of this ambition and international scale. I would like to thank our speaker today for the time and effort put into this event and the upcoming presentation. And also, in addition, to take this opportunity to thank to my colleagues working with us tonight. Upstairs, the tech team, Craig Parr and Jim Bauer. And here we'll have Simon supporting us and Catherine. And also to my colleagues that helped organizing and running this event, Sophia Lamush here tonight and Sam Thorne in the back. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoy. And now I'm going to hand over to Irit Rogoff. Thank you.
Hello. Good evening, and thank you to Nottingham Contemporary, to Carolina and Sam and Sophia and Ryan and all the people involved in this invitation. And I want to apologize in advance. I'm about to drop an awful lot of very serious wordiness on you. And to some extent, that is due to the fact that this is a project in the making, and it has many components, and I can't quite separate them yet. And so I need to refer to the different components of this project, which makes it kind of overblown and immensely wordy. And I hope it will improve soon, but not quite yet. It was really interesting to hear the panel this afternoon, to hear Tom Hollert and Anna Maria Meister talking about a particular moment in which the kind of housing of education, the spatialization of education, is about providing an infrastructure for the progressive. Because the moment that I came into the discussion of education around 2005 was the moment of the absolute abdication of that kind of modernist model, in which the education and every kind of infrastructure that sustained it were, kind of peppered with a certain amount of pedagogical inspiration and imagination, were about providing a kind of progressive future. Whereas the moment that I kind of came into this discussion was a moment in which we realized that education kind of, in the case of Europe, captured by the implications of the Bologna Accord, was actually the vehicle which delivered education to a kind of quantitative capture by the sort of regimes of comparison, of evaluation, of assessment, etc. And so I think I hadn't sort of realized quite as clearly the lines of demarcation as I did this afternoon. What I'm going to talk about this evening, which is kind of certain shifts in the understanding of research, actually is part of this kind of shift, because within neoliberal regimes of metrics, essentially, with a predominance of evaluation and credit and league tables and kind of structures of comparison, research is in fact mobilized to exactly the same ends as education is, right? So in the same way that education is now subject to a kind of competitive structure of exam results, etc. The research understood as something that can be calculated in advance, preempted, kind of calculated in terms of its impact, etc. Research is exactly in the same situation as education is, kind of packaged for a whole series of particular returns. So I'm going to talk about my bit of this very large project, which is a book called Becoming Research, which will be out next year, which I'm working on right now. And then talk a little bit about EFAP, the European Forum for Advanced Practices, which we founded 2 years ago, and which is kind of trying to come up with an alternative set of terms to the kind of run-of-the-mill evaluation structures, largely trying to extract the notion of value out of evaluation. So, like everything in the world, this starts with a story. I was on my way to the US to give a talk and needed a visa renewal. This involved applying for a visa online, waiting 3 weeks for an interview date, standing out on the street in front of the American embassy for 3 hours, in the wind and the rain while being processed to go into the building, and followed by 3 separate stages: document processing, fingerprinting, and finally an interview, all with long waits in between. The interviewing official spoke to me through a thick glass window and tried to establish the purpose of my visit, my reassuring normativity, and the likelihood of my overstaying my tourist visa. He spoke in a very formal idiom, with liberal use of the address ma'am. I kept my answers short and neutral, just enough to supply the information, but no extraneous detail to cause concern or mark myself as eccentric in any way. It had been a long, cold day of sitting around, and as I finally left the embassy that afternoon, I encountered a wall work by Jenny Holzer by the elevators. A long quote from Robert Kennedy about the need to speak up, to raise one's voice against oppression and injustice, to have the collectivization of all those voices carry a message and insist on being heard. All the way home on the bus, I kept thinking about this art, the space it was housed in, the action it was urging, the anxious mutedness of all the people who shared the queues with me during the day, waiting and waiting to hear if they can travel, the hordes of refuge seekers around the world, held in a state of waiting without resolution. The incredible contrast between the sentiment behind those words of Kennedy's and the performance of the space they now inhabited. How we work matters. Where we work matters. The ability of our work to affect cannot be taken for granted. The modes by which it is shared have to be reinvented at every given moment. At the end of the day, only one thing was clear to me. The sentiment or belief behind an artwork or its references are no guarantee for what it performs. it needs to do. And we need to understand what that doing means. Becoming research is an attempt to understand the immense shift in what practice does and how this is embedded in an exploratory sea change across the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Now, let me see if this thing works. No. Oh, it's not. Can you read it? Okay. Research is at the heart of so many of our discussions, and most often shaped and distorted to respond to a set of perceived demands. Whether contained within the scenarios of R&D or thought of as a preparatory stage in advance of some professed main event, or served up to tortured forms of evaluation, research is forever instrumentalized as part of the necessary ensemble of producing knowledge that is deemed original, verifiable, reliable, and therefore valuable. In addition, research has also been thought to be a highly academic activity, consulting great tomes of knowledge, burrowing in dusty archives, interviewing certified actors in troped scenarios, devising technical forms of supporting proof to increase the reality factor of claims made, conceptualizing experiments in a laboratory, relying on expertise from elsewhere to give credibility to a claim. Thus, research has always been perceived as operating in support of an argument, a claim, a factual reconstruction of an era, an event, a named condition. Its capacities to scrupulously investigate have always been understood as both the drive and the method of what constitutes research. But research is actually the thing itself, the event and the process of becoming. I'm invoking the Deleuzian notion of becoming in order to disrupt the telos in which research is embedded, the notion of a process given to a natural progression, instead of which, says Deleuze, we might have disrupted relationships between the discrete elements of the assemblage. In becoming, one piece of the assemblage is drawn into the territory of another piece, changing its value as an element and bringing about a new unity. Because I've got so many words here, I thought I'd put a few kind of key terms up as context, just to lessen the burden. In fact, research has changed greatly all around us, becoming an imperative, an urgency, a widespread practice quite distant from that old notion of research in the academy. One of the reasons I've been trying to conceptualize new models of research in our lives is my sense that to think of ourselves as researchers allows us a small amount of agency within a world whose rampant neoliberal drives have taken away both agency and the ability to actually argue points in terms of content and substance. So those of you who are working within institutional contexts and sit in many meetings know that hardly any discussions actually focus on content and substance, and most discussions focus on infrastructures and protocols. And that because infrastructures and protocols are much more are much easier to regulate than substance and content. The shift from someone who expresses themselves individually to the position of being a researcher is a shift in which one doesn't simply acquiesce or protest against, but one that allows to get involved with the workings of institutions, of protocols, of memory, and of community, not in compliance or in defense, but in efforts to rewrite these through their very workings. When we claim research for ourselves as an activity, we actually inhabit our numerous worlds differently, as we inform ourselves and test out different ways to think a particular reality, which is the activity of research. With the advent of ever more virulent neoliberal managerialism and rampant cognitive capitalism, we have had to constantly revise our understanding of both, so as not to lose their capacity for critical and resistant invention. If we pursue a model of knowledge as singularity, never universal, and constantly reinventing its alliances with far-flung insights, practices, and protocols, we might have a form of learning that is not so easily captive by dominant cultures of evaluation and prediction. Trying to position ourselves somewhere between neoliberal algorithmic management and questions of subjectivity, we recognize that the demand to expand, to be entrepreneurial, to act on our ambitions, to financialize everything, aims at granting us more revenue, which in turn feeds the management by algorithms with data that serves as indicators for targets or for achievements. Okay, so that's kind of our reality. The opposite realm is the realm of subjectivity. The opposite realm is the realm of subjectivity, the tension between multi-positioned knowledges and subjects, and the undefined realms that take place at the interstices of named positions, identities, and knowledges. As André Lepecki has argued in his timely and captivating study, Singularities, quote, in permeating our actions, neoliberal conditions shows us how it has captured subjectivity. If subjectivity had previously delineated the arena of stakes and relations, of affinities and solidarities, of shared imaginations and shared criticalities, the multiple and often dissonant positions of the subject, in its hijacked form, it is geared to achievement, success, forging new markets, and new desires for more than commodities, for affects, for energies, for spectacles, for expansion, growth, reach, brand recognition, and credit, above all for credit. So, for me, deconditioning, here borrowed from Lepecki, comes in the form of becoming research. It also comes with an understanding that research is not the purview of the privileged in institutions of research, but a matter of necessity. For example, a necessity for migrants to survive, for those transitioning gender to understand what they are facing biologically, legally, and civically, for those who fight for justice, and for those who simply want to do no harm, for those who develop an understanding that knowledge as spectacle, as revenue, as branding, even when it is about harm, actually does harm. What has changed so fundamentally in contemporary understandings of research is that we have shifted ground, shifted from working from inherited knowledges to working from conditions. So these are some of the kind of bullet points that I've put out. So I would say that the shift from researching something, something legible, to becoming research is the shift from working from inherited knowledges to working from conditions. So for me, that's the kind of entry point. And what I mean by that is conventionally research has acknowledged a body of knowledge that came before it, found a kind of a niche with which to add something new or something revisionist at the tail end of what had accumulated before us, and would fit in within either a discipline or a field or a set of questions. So shifting from working from inherited knowledges to working from conditions. These conditions become the drive, not the subject matter of the work. They anchor investigation differently, disconnected from the historical and procedural annals of how a body of knowledge has come about, of what sustains its claims to originality and legitimacy, of how a body of knowledge claims an identity. Disciplinary, technological, theoretical, material, there are different identities that knowledge claims. They intervene in the false divisions between the academic, the creative, the professional, and the performative. Instead, they offer a series of current vectors as entry points that point to urgencies, not in the journalistic sense of an urgency as some kind of spectacular drama, but in the sense that certain events, certain conditions, certain atmospheres cannot be isolated as only such, but demand a complete reconfiguration of how to know. No one living in Trump's US or Orban's Hungary or Netanyahu's Israel or Bolsonaro's Brazil would argue with the assumption that these are not events, but they are conditions. Research, as we experience it now in both institutional and culturally active contexts, has moved away from stable bodies of knowledge to be excavated, as well as away from recognized subjects whose validity is universally recognized. So hopefully this is what I'm doing here is right. No, it's not. It's not the refresh button. It's not this one? Okay. Recently, my colleague Adnan Madani has kind of made me want to look at the work of Ernst Bloch, which I haven't actually looked at for many years, and particularly at the ontology of the not yet. Hope, Bloch says, can be located in the not yet. And he speaks of an ontology of not yet being in which we are continually building a concrete utopia. If you drop to the end of this long quote, the claim of an ontology of the not yet is that the society we ended up with would therefore be the product of the processes of getting there, which is very close to my understanding of what becoming research is. And the absolute, I don't think I'm going to sign up for hope at this particular moment in time, but I think that the notion of the not yet is one of the tools that we might be able to mobilize in order to counter the notions of the quantifiable, right? So the fact that the quantifiable within the not yet cannot emerge as a kind of legible promise, but as a rather blurred kind of arena, which we might populate otherwise. So research as we experience it now is both institutional and culturally active contexts has moved away from stable bodies of knowledge to be excavated, as well as away from recognized subjects whose validity is universally recognized. Research is now the arena in which we negotiate knowledge we have inherited with the conditions of our lives. These conditions, whether economic, geographical, or propelled by subjectivity, have become the drive, not the subject matter of the work. And it is here, in the immersion in conditions, that research transforms from an investigative impulse to the constitution of new realities. It is thus that we recognize that research is not some elevated activity requiring a great deal of prior knowledge, nor is it simply the urge to find things out. It is in many ways the stuff of daily life. Every form of hardship encountered, whether one is an immigrant or living out catastrophic conditions, affected by emotional sea changes or crises of identity or of security, generates research, and everyone researches. And the forms of current research have equally shifted as contemporary multivalent research moves between archival, documentary, conceptual, and performative modes and utilizes everything from fictioning, docudramatizing, to mimicry of the queer animation of archives, to structural self-instituting, to producing new realities of knowledge. Moving farther and farther from the assembling of information, research has undergone a process of singularization, becoming relational in form, shifting as it changes locations and experiences unexpected encounters, no longer framed by how it originally came into the world, the discipline or professional practice that once named it. It is, in the words of Giorgio Agamben, whatever knowledge. In Agamben's term, whatever is being such as it always matters. When I first encountered Agamben's argument about whatever, I thought, surely it's not the whatever of San Fernando Valley teenagers, right? Whatever. But the longer I've lived with it, the more convinced I am that it actually is precisely that. That the sort of the unwillingness to engage in terms of the debate or the imposed conditions is very similar in both cases. Singularity, Agamben argues, is thus freed from the false dilemma that obliges knowledge to choose between the ineffability of the individual and the intelligibility of the universal. So contemporary research practices occupy neither exclusively, right? Neither the ineffability of the individual nor the intelligibility of the universal. Neither the realm of universally acknowledged formal learning, nor the realm of pure self-expression. They are instead a harnessing of both in a new relation to one another, a relation that cannot be contained by scholarship or by individual experience, but plots out the ground for shared social communication of conditions, drives, and lines of flight. New research, then, is the inhabitation of conditions in another modality, one that responds to formal knowledges but does not adhere to it, as well as one that invokes the subjectivity of those conditions but does not narrate it as such. So, and I think this is a really important point about research, is that it is not a departure from formal knowledges into experience, and it is not the narration of experience as pure individual condition, but it is a kind of fluid set of relations that emerges between the two, a kind of dance between these elements that allows both to have equal legitimacy without one having the authority of universally acclaimed knowledge and the other being, sort of purely the annals of what we experience and what we feel. It is crucial to insist on this fundamental change in both the impulse that propels research and the new forms it takes, because institutions of higher education and museums and other cultural institutions have instrumentalized advanced research practices for a host of pragmatic ends. In order to have reasons for expansion and variety, in order to satisfy public sector demands that knowledge be produced and be shown to circulate, and in order to garner whatever resources might be available, and in order to claim greater numbers for their programs. Using the creative industries terminology of, these are the three most odious words in the English language: innovative, imaginative, and cutting edge. So using this creative industries terminology, emergent research practices, as they are presently framed within institutions, are losing their critical potential as they become the latest cog in the wheel of cognitive capitalism. There are increasingly public relations sound bites in the endless pursuit of the new for higher education and cultural institutional market ends. Instead, we can keep in mind the many potential contributions that new forms of research in the art world have been able to introduce. So, first of all, the possibility of making the art world more than it is, of being less captive by the market, of being about more than tangible art, but instead having some concrete forms of indicating immersive processes rather than celebrating products. The recognition that these new forms of hybrid and imaginative research activity require an entire new vocabulary in which we begin to understand how we have gained permission for exiting the older formations of knowledge and reforming the world around us through urgent concerns. The understanding that we now need to articulate new models of research as well as those for performing, delivering, displaying, and viewing of new practices. How can displays be constantly productive rather than passively performative. And this is something that curatorially I deal with all the time, which is a dilemma, a rather surprising dilemma, that while we've thought a great deal about doing research, we've thought a great deal about exhibiting research, we've given absolutely no thought to what it means to be the viewer of research. And this is, I think, an immensely complicated dilemma, because the viewing of research is not being the recipient of a huge amount of information. It has to be something transformative, but we've given very little thought to the actual ways, the dramaturgies, the possibilities. I think there's been, within kind of institutional pedagogy of display, there's been quite a lot of thinking about interactivity, et cetera, as a form of kind of activating knowledge. But within the actual contemporary art and curatorial and knowledge production practices of putting forward, making research manifest, putting it forward in some way, we've actually not given a great deal of thought about it. And I look at the people who come to the exhibitions that I curate, and they look exhausted. I think they are exhausted. And it's because, we've thought several parts of the trajectory, but we haven't thought the other parts of the trajectory. And that seems really, really crucial. So how can displays be constantly productive rather than passively informative? What does it mean to be the viewer of research? And can it provide us with an alternative form of participation? One that is less institutionally located and more interior, seeing ourselves as fields of amalgamated knowledges. And this is a real transition from, let's say, the identity politics of the demographic thinking that institutions do, where they assume that the members of society coming from demographic groups that don't normally take part in kind of mainstream cultural institutional activity actually want to see themselves and their experiences reflected, which I am convinced is a fallacy, right? I think they want to become, as we all want to become, a kind of field of amalgamated knowledges in which we have constantly different and differing points of entry into that field. It is as such that research, in the contemporary sense, is both a set of new relations as well as a set of critical insights. It is as such that research links hands with the ongoing desire for criticality in a world in which one cannot step outside of the problematics, cannot ever exit and have an external viewing position. Research, in the final analysis, is the potential for immersion and engagement without drawing conclusions and making predictions, the potential for making the world our own. So this part is the kind of my part in this very large-scale project of thinking the notion of becoming research. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of the work that we've been doing within this organization that I mentioned, the European Forum for Advanced Practices, and also what we've got invested in trying to kind of put forward and fully furnish a notion of advanced practices as a certain kind of umbrella. So this began as a completely self-organized forum by those of us with a certain amount of experience within higher education, research structures, and cultural institutions, who became increasingly worried about the bureaucratization of every form of new knowledge almost as soon as it emerged, right? So universities began setting up endless kind of higher degrees for practice-driven research before we actually, and I'm, as much part of it as anyone else, before we actually had a full understanding of what it was, what it did, what terms we might deploy in order to really understand what its capacities in the world were. We were also deeply concerned about the kind of neoliberal bureaucratization of every form of emergent knowledge through assessment and evaluation. So here, we gained a great deal from the work of Brian Masumi in 99 Theses on the Revaluation of Value, in which he of thesis number 1 is a kind of declaration in which he says it's time to take back value. For many, value has long been dismissed as a concept so thoroughly compromised, so soaked in normative strictures, and stained by complicity with capitalist power as to be unredeemable. This has only abandoned value to purveyors of normativity and apologists of economic oppression. Value is too valuable to be left in those hands. So the kind of the fact that Masumi was working very much at the same moment on trying to re-understand the notion of value was an enormous encouragement within this enterprise. So we formed a group of about 40 people from all over Europe. We were both self-organized and self-funded, and we set ourselves 2 tasks. First of all, to kind of listen to each other's concerns about what was happening in the fields of contemporary art, higher education, cultural institutions, research funding, and to kind of forge an amalgamated and forge and articulate an amalgamated set of concerns. We then wanted to advance the notion of advanced practices, which I'll talk about in a minute, and to write a charter for these advanced practices, which we've now done. A couple of weeks ago, our website went online, and it's just called Advanced Practices, one word, .net. And you can find everything that I've been kind of mentioning up there. Now, the urgencies and drives behind this was, as I said, the shift in research from inherited knowledges to working from conditions. The regimes of assessment, evaluation, and preemption. The preemption of research long before it actually takes place in terms of what its future value might be, what the kind of future interests might be, etc. And the need to recognize a broader arena of knowledge producers. So to kind of not just de-hierarchize, but deprofessionalize research and recognize all of the arenas in which research takes place. I wanted to kind of put forward what for me are really important terms in trying to drive this. And the first of these, and maybe the most important of these, is the notion of permission. And I've been thinking about permission for a really long time and trying to understand how it's not something that is granted to us, right? There is no authority that gives us permission to do what it is that we need to do, but it's something that we struggle for. And in the same way that Bloch says the societies to come are a product of the process of their achievement, that is precisely, I think, what happens with permission. It's not that we get it, that we struggle for it, and that becomes kind of the set of protocols by which we operate. It's not authorized because there is no authorizing entity, and it's imagined, it's propositional. It's not legitimating, but emancipating. And most importantly, it's not consumed, but suspended. And so the notion that permission is a multiple process of suspensions that take place, I think is crucial for me to understand how permission operates. And the other term is singularity, the new relational mode of subjects and of knowledges, the coming together in contingency in response to an urgency or to the need to find ways of dancing together beyond identity. So the kind of end of separation by disciplines, by levels, by degrees, but an understanding that knowledge never sits quietly within whatever box it's provided with. It always is in a process of eruption and creating relations with other knowledges. Sorry, this was supposed to be before. So this is IFAP. And these are the concerns, and I think I've mentioned them, but I can mention them again. The need to better understand the challenges of new research modes emanating from the arts and impacting across academic fields, creative processes, and institutional frameworks. So one of the things that I've found most fascinating about the sort of work in recent years is that research as it is developed within contemporary creative practices has impacted across the humanities and the social sciences. So, for example, contemporary anthropology, the status of creative writing within literature departments, these kind of the fact that we have visual anthropology, visual sociology, that the sort of elements of fictioning have become part of most disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences and have extended far beyond into the kind of protocols of everywhere, right, including multinational corporations. A friend of mine told me that Shell, the oil company, has a department of fiction in which 70 writers sit and write fiction scenarios of what, the future of oil might be. Or Siemens recently invited an entire group of conceptual artists to come and examine their management protocols and reflect them back to them in a kind of narrative form that might provide a kind of broken mirror to how they understand their own management protocols. And so this sort of impact of practice-driven research is across an entire landscape of knowledges, of institutions, and of management structures. And so we really need to understand that, and it's not about people studying particular kinds of artistic practices. It's about a certain form of permission that is gained through these. And that's why permission is so important to me in this particular case. So, better understanding the challenges of new research modes emanating from the arts and impacting across academic fields, creative processes, and institutional frameworks. The need to intervene in the processes of assessment, evaluation, monitoring, and preemption, which dominate all of our work across our funding structures. The need to establish extra-institutional platforms that can develop these sensibilities, recognize their potential, and inform our institutions of their value. And the need to insist on emancipating the notion of value from within the structure's evaluation. And here, that kind of emancipation means a stretching out beyond kind of categories through which it can be assessed, towards what we care about, what we feel is urgent, what excites us, and what outrages us. All of which, I think, are criteria of value. They are indeed problematic words, and I always feel the need to kind of put things right, which is that the European Forum is not a European Forum. It's not an identity. It's not about cultural identities, cultural European identities, but a set of conditions and circumstances that we share and that affect our work. And the word advanced is not excellence, but making space for what might come, the ontology of the not yet. Okay, and I want to sort of end with this. And do I want to end with this? Hang on a second. No, I actually want to move forward. All of this stuff is on the website, so instead of, kind of embroiling you in I wanted to talk about, just end with the 5 principles that we are at the moment in our charter thinking about. The first one is that advanced practices shift paradigms, that they operate as a form of tectonics. Paradigm shifts are a process of working with a problematic without the framework of assumptions or the drive of a goal. Such shifts continually redefine how things are measured and always operate as temporally specific mechanisms. Paradigm shifts cannot be claimed, have not been invented, cannot be arrived at individually, and are not authored. So the entire set of mechanism of capture is evaded. Paradigm shifts are states of contemporary recognition or of reconnecting with radical historical moments as indicators of permission and possibility. And this is something, and I think that your 2 presentations earlier were very much about the permission to connect with radical historical moments, and we're not to be in continuity of them, but have them as the moment of permission. It's precisely about a moment of permission. Secondly, advanced practices reframe urgencies, questioning who defines what an urgency is, insisting that urgencies are not priorities, they are rather an aggregate of conditions that demand a response. Thus, we recognize that advanced practices are making urgencies visible and providing alternative frameworks to know them, countering the hegemonic employment of urgencies that serve to normalize or suppress them as legible subject matter. Thinking through situated and locatable urgencies and how these are linked to opening up Western conditions to world conditions and vice versa. So the sort of ability to reframe urgencies rather than to pursue a politics driven by a notion of inclusion, which then just becomes a kind of aggregate and does not actually change the kind of systemic foundation of what we're thinking. Thirdly, advanced practices invent methodologies. They pose questions as to the recognition of a moment of methodological invention, articulate who commissioned the research, or whether it is a project of self-commissioning, recognize that the choice of subject is never value-free, and that we invent our own subjects and mobilize processes of diffraction and of densification. Enumerate emergent modes of deploying fictioning, querying, invented vocabularies, eccentric forms of verification, and of information collecting. The invention of archives or their misreading, and acknowledge the links to communities of practice and of experience that underpin the research. And aside from kind of needing to search out different groundings for arriving at knowledge, such as experience, the other thing that is really crucial about inventing methodologies is the fact that the particular urgencies of our world, precarity, extinction, the extraction, the violence of mobilities, that none of these could possibly be dealt with through any kind of stable methodology, because these are all about things that are in processes of kind of violent eruption and violent mobility. So to then subdue them to a state of really stable methodologies is to precisely not encounter them. It's to subdue them. And so the invention of methodologies is absolutely crucial when one is working from within a set of contemporary urgencies. The staging of new relations between knowledges, so departing from the older model of interdisciplinarity to more contemporary notions of singularization, the coming together in time and space of different situated knowledges in specific and uncategorizable alliances, recognizing a multiplicity of knowledges in simultaneous play, tacit, implicit, bodily, intellectual, all subject to a form of valorization that deliver it back into specific economies. Emergent regimes of digitalization and of algorithmic control have produced access and availability, as well as new regimes of research. Shifting baselines that reject notions of normal, of tradition, of individuality, the necessary emergence of a collaborative model. How are these staged? And finally, the notion of exceeding expectations, which I think I'm ambivalent about because of the exceeding expectations as marketing talk. It's about, recognizing new markets and potential audiences, etc. But still, it might have some traction in relation to knowledge production. Dismissing the assumed relation between a threshold and a research project, learning to mutualize the dynamics of expectations, learning to thematize trust as a research value, to recognize affection and mutuality as drives, and to unfold notions of failure within expectations. Developing models that bypass the evaluation of concluding findings, recognizing that expectations are for arriving at new questions and new modes of posing them and inhabiting them. And all of this, as I say, is up on the website of Advanced Practices and kind of fully articulated, as are the various workings of the forum. We started, as I said, as a self-organized group. We met in the attic of an institution in Brussels, and we were fondly known in Brussels as the fantasists in the attic. We recently received a large European grant, and that means that we're much more regulated. We have kind of serious protocols which we have to pursue. And it's probably an inevitable step. And so we quickly wanted to publish this charter because even though it's very wordy and very dense, it does reflect those 2 years of working together in an attic without kind of knowing what we were sending out into the world. Sorry. And this is our launch in Madrid in October. And the person speaking is my colleague Florian Schneider, with whom I co-founded EFAB. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Irit, for this incredible journey through mobilizing research, I think, for other purposes. And I think that's definitely a lot to unpack. I think I'm struggling just to prioritize what I would like to bring to the fore first. But I just to kind of connect to our afternoon session, where we were focusing much more on physical architecture and thinking in terms of how space, how the design of space fosters, promotes, encourages certain performances within that space. And how now I have the feeling that we are moving towards a different sense of architecture, a different sense of structure or ways of structuring the way we produce knowledge and the way knowledge is understood. So probably here thinking less in terms of architecture, but more in terms of infrastructure. As Keller Esterling would think of, is not the event, is not the building, is not the most visible aspect of the landscape, but actually the connectivities, the environment, and its operativity, I guess. So I think what you're doing now sits more in relation to that, like less visible aspects of that articulation, but nevertheless incredibly instrumental for how things are brought together and how they function. So I guess what I would like to touch upon first is this idea of kind of reclaiming research. Because I'm a bit intrigued since, as you said at the beginning, and I completely agree, along with education, research are very much captive. They do have their modes of regulation. They are subsumed to quantitative regimes of logics and protocols of measurement and metrics, etc. And so there's kind of a through your talk, I was thinking that research is being positioned in a different location. It's not necessarily the one that comes to our mind when we think of research in terms of academic research, but it doesn't exclude it either, I would say. But nevertheless, it's kind of taking a step further, I would say, and even along the lines of Arjuna Padurai's claim of the right to research. In the sense that research is already taking place elsewhere. And so how to make that not only visible in terms of, again, like the declamatory event, but just to make sure that that ecology is also recognized as operative. So just to go back to the fact that I was a bit puzzled, why reclaiming research? Why research, which is such a heavy term, and so grounded on these metrics, logics, etc. So I think my question to you, just to start, is where do you see the potential? You outlined that necessarily in your talk, but if you could say a bit more about that.
Well, I think if what you're looking for is the potentials for change, which is, I guess, what I'm always looking for, then research as something that is not capturable, but as a kind of dynamic process in which no preemption can take place, none of the outcomes are foreseeable, then the processes in some way animate us, seems to me to be one of the potentials for change that I can see. And so I think it's that. I think being interested in practice-driven research in contemporary art kind of led me to understand that this has impacted across a huge range of, it's impacted the market because it's not as consumable, it's consumable, but it's not as consumable as objects that are not kind of grounded in long lines of research that are somehow made manifest. So it's impacted that, it's impacted modes of exhibiting, and it's impacted kind of relations. And if you feel that we are not just badly served, but actually hampered by the kind of regimes of assessment and evaluation that that we're mired in, then of all the kind of elements in this kind of chain, I think it's the one that can most turn. It's the most dynamic. It's the one can most turn. And then the sort of the fact that, you know, all of these scholars are turning to some kind of a practice, and it's, you know, it's even partly autobiographic. When we started visual cultures at Goldsmith, we were really theorists, all of us. We were pure theorists. And over time, each and every one of us, without discussing it or deciding on it as a policy, developed a practice. Because it became clear that the ideas that we were preoccupied with couldn't be stretched and tested out purely theoretically. And so filmmakers and performance artists and curators and opera, you know, librettists, etc., now sit within a sort of a bunch of theorists. And I find that the fact that this is not policy, but this is simply something that happened because it was necessary, to be very indicative. I think the new relations between knowledges that I spoke of is, I think it's very interesting. I think it's part of a challenge. I work with a collective called Free Thought. There are 6 of us. Each one of us comes from a fairly different kind of body of knowledge. And in the last project that we did, Stefano Harney, who's a member of the collective, wrote an absolutely brilliant paper called Shipping and the Shipped. And it was about the history of shipping. And we were working in Norway, and Norway has a very illustrious kind of history of shipping. And the fact that you cannot divorce the history of shipping from its human cargo of the ship, i.e. from the slave trade, which, unbeknownst to me, through Stefano's researches, we found out Norway had a considerable stake in. as did virtually everybody else in the world. So he wrote this really amazing paper, quite short, in which the kind of full power of his learning was operating around logistics, around economies. And he then gave it to a series of artists and left it with them. And they started developing a whole series of projects which didn't illustrate his thesis, but kind of took from it. So he provided them with a permission for thinking about the kind of watery circulation of goods and human cargoes and national identities and territorial conquests and the rise of markets and the distribution of race around the globe. He gave them permission through this, and they went on and did completely different things with it. Mm-hmm. And so there was nothing illustrative about the work that we then ended up commissioning, except that this was its touchstone. This is where it began. And I think tracking those kinds of relations between knowledges is extremely important to me, mm-hmm. because they allow something to happen without dictating how it's going to happen, mm-hmm. or dictating the terms by which it's going to happen.
I would like to pick up on one of the things you mentioned now when you're talking about modes of exhibiting, and also how you explained that after the foundation of, or at the beginning in the visual cultures department, you were all theorists, but then practice in a way came as, well, I would say a complement, just to not to develop too much because it's in a way part of the question. But I wanted to take that, not necessarily situate in a strict academic setting, but think in terms of curatorial practices. And think, because you mentioned as well, so not only the modes of exhibiting, but you mentioned something that I would like to go back to, which has to do with the viewing of research. But just in terms of what is traditionally, let's say, the output of curatorial practices, exhibition, it seems to me that from what you're saying, exhibition is not the end result of a research process. It seems like there's something being activated in the display that is not just about more information about something, right? So now we have here, like, now we complement the knowledge you might have about lighting, and here it is. So it seems like there's something else happening there. Not only with the audience, but those that are also developing the process of exhibition making. Could you tell us a bit more about what's the role of practice there? So what's happening in this moment of display that is not only the final result, but is something else, is probably a stepping stone. If you could just...
I'm not sure that I can, but I think of it in terms of Derrida's notion of the send-off. So Derrida was asked to found the Philosophy College in Paris in 1983, and he wrote a book called The Eyes of the University, and he said the act of founding the Collège de Philosophie was a send-off, that something got lobbed into the air, and without any notion of where it would land or what it would do. So to set up an institution under the aegis of a send-off, right, that doesn't kind of preempt and predict or produce protocols, is, I think, exactly what happens with practice, as it's driven by research, that it opens the lid on something and doesn't necessarily plot the kind of way that it would operate. I think maybe most important for me about practice is that it produces a set of non-illustrative manifestations, right? That it's not about illustrating some issue or some problem. It's about dancing around it and finding multiple entry points into it. And the way in which Extinction Rebellion's been operating recently, I mean, I've only sort of come across it in London. I think it's been operating differently in different places in the world. But when you heard people talk, they were in it for different reasons, right? They weren't all pointing to one aspect of out of control climate change as the reason they were in it. There was a whole kind of set of reasons that anchored them in this action. And I think that's how practice does research. And that's what interests me about it. Because for people like me, I learn two things, I think. I mean, I learn lots of things, but majorly I learn two things. One is that there are different entry points to problematics that I thought I could only think about frontally, right? That frontality is a kind of Enlightenment conceit that we really don't need anymore. So that's kind of really important. And the other is what do you have at your disposal that you can mobilize for research? So those kind of moments, for me, that terrible day I spent at the American Embassy was really a kind of crystallizing moment, because there was Jenny Holzer. I thought, what's Jenny Holzer and Robert Kennedy doing within the oppressive regimes of, visa kind of certification in the American Embassy, and how the fact that something pertaining to be about progressive politics isn't about progressive politics unless it does something. And that the way in which you couldn't just co-opt Jenny Holzer and Robert Kennedy into the American Embassy and decorate their draconian regimes with it in order to kind of make everything come out all right in the end. And so it was a really interesting moment in thinking, actually, it does the opposite. It reveals in a completely unexpected way how far, this particular country, this particular state, its regimes have traveled.
So the way you were describing the send-off, as Derrida puts it, it's incredibly difficult in the context where we operate today, because in institutions, be it HE sector or cultural sector, the reporting and the measurability and the metrics are so heavy that it's very hard to leave some space open for that kind of for the process, for not knowing where one is going, because we need to determine from the beginning, in a way, almost what's gonna happen, and so that's a big challenge, I think, for everyone sitting here working under those conditions. So I think, just to go back, because you mentioned conditions, I think would be interesting to think how you understand, where do I want to go here? The question would be to look at what you understand by conditions in this kind of very specific neoliberal situation. And how kind of tropes or ruses can be kind of developed in order to postpone that final result, or this idea of defining what's going to happen. Because it seems to me that one of the things that's happening at various levels currently, I would say in the UK, because it's where I've been working for almost 10 years now, is that there's a sense of threat when things are complex, when things are not clearly presented, or there's no clear entry points provided. And I think this has to do with discussions about accessibility in various sectors, but also in the cultural sector. And I think this is something that really needs digesting and processing, which is by providing very clear cultural products that provide also the entry points, as if we know in advance what the entry points are. The sense of even building knowledge together, even being able to discover what those entry points are and what that cultural object, product, activity, event is actually doing. It seems like, to me, that things are more and more complicated. In the HE sector, we know that, rightly so, students now demand value for money because of the tremendous fees they are. And
I think that that's a fallacy. I have had an ongoing argument with a person who tellingly is both in charge of approving new academic programs as well as for their marketing, right? It's the same person. And that to me is very telling. I've had an ongoing argument with him. Luckily, he's resigned. In which I was proposing some new degree, and he was very skeptical about anybody wanting to do this degree because he said it does not provide a pathway to employment. So I went back to the class I was teaching at that moment, and I said, "Are you looking for a pathway to employment? Why are you here?" And they said, "No." So I said, "So what are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, we want to learn new things." And I swear this is the language that they used. It's not me imposing something on them. They said, "We want to transform our consciousness." I thought, that's interesting. So I went back to the person in charge of permission and marketing. And I said, "Well, this is what my students said. So instead of me running back and forth between the students and you, why don't you just come to class and ask them yourself what they're looking for?" And he said, "I will not come to class. I do not need to come to class because I have an algorithm. I feed it the information I need, and it comes out with, the decision about whether this degree or that degree are sort of." So the question, it seems to me, is about legibility, right? What is legibly kind of useful, productive, worth investing in, and what is not legibly so? And I think that only we can produce a new language that in some way kind of underwrites our real needs, not assumed needs. And I think that there's been a lot of really interesting kind of efforts in that direction. And it's got to do with flipping, that a term that is a really oppressive term, kind of pushed out and pushed out and pushed out, can be flipped over and start to mean something else. So Moten and Harney did it with debt, right? They took a highly kind of negative term as debt, and they pushed at it and pushed at it and pushed at it and said, actually, debt is the way by which we are individualized and atomized and segregated and made to feel that finance is our personal responsibility rather than a societal condition. And flipping debt allows us to kind of make it social, right? It's a place in which we meet together. And I thought that was an incredibly interesting way to work with a really demonized term, especially after 2008. And so in EFAP, we recently have started the second phase of our work, which is to write a vocabulary book. So I was chairing it for somebody who was absent a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things, so we thought, okay, well, there are about 12 of us, we're really smart, we're really knowledgeable, we all have access to a lot of language. We'll get into a room and we'll invent ourselves a language. 2 hours later, we were tearing our hair out, realizing that it's absolutely impossible to invent a new language. And I was thinking about, Freud in 1893 saying the word unconscious for the first time, or Foucault saying the word genealogy for the first time. They didn't invent a language. They were so immersed in a set of conditions, intellectual conditions, that the conditions pushed them into the necessity of articulating something different. And so I realized that we can't invent a language. So we decided to take up some categories. So the words that most oppress us, we're going to try and push at as much as we possibly can to see if we can flip them. The words that are used in evaluation culture that don't work, right? The dysfunctional words. So we're going to take a whole set of words around us that are either oppressive or simply failing to do whatever it is they're meant to do, and start by pushing at those, realizing that it's not possible to just, off the cuff, invent a whole new language. So it was a really interesting kind of exercise on how to, because only we can invent a vocabulary for our needs, but we can't do it. And then, of course, slowly came the realization that to sit in a room and conceitedly assume that you can come up with a new vocabulary is precisely neoliberal protocol, right? And so that the habits of neoliberalism are so deeply ingrained in us and in the ways in which we do our research and our work that you have to kind of get yourself out of those habits before you can actually do something.
Thank you. Shall we open to the floor? Is there any questions, comments? There's two here.
Okay, is this working? Yeah. Thank you so much. I have, and you just talked about how this is, in a sense, a language project.
The mic system is not great. Can you slow down a bit?
Yes. So I have a question relating to what you said at the end, that it is, in a way, a language project, in a certain sense. And I was wondering, on the one hand, whether it's a descriptive or prescriptive project, and I guess it's somewhere in between. But so I have two things. One is, you said in the beginning of the talk something about how research, when it's exhibited, for example, or viewed, is that we don't think about that as much. And I was just going to ask, maybe it is when it's exhibited, not research. Maybe one of the problems is that then we use the same term, even though it gets transformed into something else when it's being looked at. So that's the first comment. And the second question is something that might be too complicated for a question after a lecture, but it's something that I, with colleagues, especially in the history of science, have been thinking about a lot, and the field is struggling with, and that's what you termed singularization. So I see the promise in the term by making it this encounter between someone and something in a kind of field or engagement with knowledge. But and it's that what the history of science tries to figure out in a way to make knowledge less universal, make science less universal, and understand it as a kind of field condition of many different relationships. But then what do we do with the flip side of that when it becomes a kind of, not by the same people, but on the flip side, when it becomes the kind of abdication of the belief in any kind of facts or science? So what do you do with singularization when it becomes so extreme that there's no relationability or accountability anymore?
Yeah, I'll try. I think what I'm talking about is not a way of, it's not turning away from the kind of, great accumulated bodies of knowledge. And it's not a turning away from, let's say, historicizing, setting up archives for that which has not had an archive before, etc., because those are immensely valuable. But it's about the possibility of having another relation to knowledge that is not rooted, but circulating, right? And that's where singularization comes in. It's the sort of ability for knowledge to circulate, and as it circulates, find unexpected partnerships. The problem with fields and disciplines and kind of modes of unearthing is the way in which it polices the possibility of a set of unexpected relations. So I don't think it's a dismissal. I think it's, it all has to kind of somehow work together. But here is where the issue of legibility comes in. I mean, I'm old enough and experienced enough to have sat on endless amounts of, funding councils and assessment councils and God knows what. And to see how people respond to the unfamiliar and how relieved they are when it can be attached to something legible. And and to think, what can we do about that? Because new knowledge can never be legible. It simply cannot be legible. So and how do we do that? How do we make that journey from the illegibility of new knowledge to the promise, Ernst Bloch's promise, that hope is somehow embedded in it, and make that into a kind of convincing argument without the sort of process of instrumentalizing it in advance, which is, what all research strategies want. They want advanced kind of instrumentalization of knowledge. So kind of thinking about the circuitry? I don't know what the word, but sorry? Circulatory maybe, I don't know. But that which involves circuits, right, that are not linear in any way, but kind of relational. And that's where singularity comes in. The other thing about singularity that I really sort of value is its contingency, right? That it's always around a kind of coming together of some things or some people or some beliefs in relation to something we're faced with. So this is the kind of process by which singularities come up. And that very often there's that wonderful essay of Agamben's about Tiananmen Square, where it's just a page and a half, and he says, why was the reaction of the authorities to Tiananmen Square manifestations so ferocious? And he says, because they didn't demand anything. They had one demand which had to do with the release of a particular dissident, and he was immediately released. And the rest of Tiananmen Square was without demands. It was an embodiment. It was a manifestation. And that brought about a far more ferocious response than had there been some demands which then could have been negotiated with, refused, acquiesced, compromised, etc. Because that is what makes it legible. But 100,000 people just standing there, ontologically being, that's a singularization. And that is so powerful that it can bring on itself that level of ferocious response. And so that's how I'm thinking about singularization, around real issues in my world, around legibility, identity, the sort of need to belong to a family of knowledge or an ideological position or a set of beliefs that people will recognize, as good, as productive, as progressive, etc. So those are the kinds of questions behind it. And I've forgotten the first thing you've said. I think you're possibly right. I mean, I have no way to predict whether research is going to remain research, or it's going to transmutate into something else. I don't have the language yet, and may never have it. But certainly around research, there's so many kind of systemic kind of classifications. This kind of research, that kind of research, does this, does that, falls into this box, leads to that or that. Useful for the industry, not useful for the industry. To just kind of complicate it and densify it and make it stroppy and make it not sit, comfortably within its boxes, that's already a beginning. So, now when somebody says research, I say, what precisely do you mean by research? What is it doing? In what way is it doing it? Does it do anything? And there are ways of animating that, I think.
Thank you. There was another question over there. Sophia, no? No? Okay. There's a question here.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. I was looking at your kind of synopsis, the entrance of your talk tonight, and I'm coming from two opposite sides of things, actually. I'm a scientist and an artist. So it might be that's why I'm couching this particular question or discussion. The first paragraph, the centrality of contemporary arts practices, developing new forms and expression research grounded in invention and speculation rather than in proof and verification, is at the heart of this term. Now, I have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying, your thesis, if you like. I have written down two things. What has been lost and what has been gained? And is there actually a competition? Has nothing been lost and nothing been gained? In other words, are we able to do both? I mean, on the science side, proof and verification is at the heart of it a lot of the time. Or it can be made to seem that way,
Well, yeah, it can be made.
Yes, this is, I take your context, and I just wanted your comments on that. You may have actually answered it. Forms of research, you talked about, areas where you might have to have a different emphasis, or maybe they're both still there, but it's just a question of which you emphasize more, or not.
We put them in a different sort of relation. to one another. There's a Radio 4 series of broadcasts at the moment called Great Innovations, and it's coming from the Science Museum in London. And the beginning of the first program, it's the woman who's the chief curator of the Science Museum and another person who I didn't get his name, or somebody else from the Science Museum. And they said the old relation between science and the arts has completely imploded and bears no relevance to what's going on now, because scientists need to be fiercely imaginative and artists need to be rigorously investigative. And I was standing in the kitchen, I said, yes, this is absolutely perfect. And the fact, maybe the Science Museum is a great deal more adventurous than I think it is. But I thought the fact that a mainstream kind of museum that investigates knowledge says that as its kind of degree zero for the investigation that followed was just great.
Well done.
Do we have more comments? Burning questions? Is getting close to 8:30. If we can get one more question, probably.
Just a very short question. I was just wondering if advanced practices, how you situate it geographically, or what kind of places do you imagine these different forms coming together to circulate? So what kind of geographic mobility or situatedness do you envision?
That's a really great question, and I can't pretend to have an answer for it. I think it has to be preceded. Partly, I've always been interested in a fluidity of movement in and out of institutions. The fact that there has to be a kind of, like, universities and certain kinds of cultural institutions are research-intensive environments. What happens when that then kind of, goes out? One of the, for a while I was writing a lot and thinking a lot about what was called the educational turn 10 years ago. And one of the things that really interested me was the relation between kind of research-driven thinking in institutions, the way in which that was then given a whole set of forms by contemporary art practices, and then migrated to kind of protest movements around the world, and the forms, not necessarily the knowledges, and became integrated in a set of kind of political protests. And so because one of the things that's been really interesting about the sort of protest movements around the globe since, let's say, 2010, has been the degree of learning embedded in them. So Zuccotti Park, Occupy New York, Occupy everywhere, social justice protest movements, Arab Spring, different movements within what so-called Arab Spring. The sort of research and investigation are absolutely integral. When I started looking at what was being produced in terms of texts by all of these movements, it was astonishing. Like Occupy London had a newspaper that came out twice a week, which was called the Occupy Times, which I have collected all the copies of, which is quite astonishing. The sort of resistance to draconian migration policies produced the Make World newspaper, which was kind of circulated nomadically around the world. So I think that the way in which things move from
research-intensive environments to kind of initiating a whole set of new forms, be they spatial or choreographic or visual or sonic, and then the way that moves to political manifestation on the street is one of the ways in which I think about that movement, which is kind of really interesting. And I also love the fact that it's not lived experience migrating into the academy where it can be kind of tied down and legitimated as a form of knowledge, but the exact opposite way around. Sort of ideas moving out of the academy into worlds of practice, into worlds of social and political protest.
Thank you, Irit, for the presentation and also for addressing these thought-provoking questions. I just wanted, before we leave, just to say that we are very happy to confirm that Farid Rakun is traveling to Nottingham at the moment, so not stranded in Frankfurt anymore. So for those of you here for the workshop with Farid, he will be giving the workshop tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. So do please come and join us. And I also wanted to say that we reconvene tomorrow here at 12 tomorrow, and we'll be joined by Kehinde Andrews and Ola Uduku. And there will be a series of panels and screenings and finally a keynote at the end of the day. So please join us, and in this particular occasion, join me in thanking Irit Rogoff for your presence here tonight.